The Balkans were one of the most genetically diverse regions in ancient Europe. Greeks, Illyrians, Thracians, Dacians, Romans, populations layered on each other for millennia. Thracians alone had lived here for over 3,000 years before Rome ever arrived. The Romans ruled the Balkans for 5 centuries. Their genetic signature mixed with the indigenous populations. Roman infrastructure transformed the region. Roads, aqueducts, cities, 5 centuries of building. Before the Romans, the Thracians lived here for millennia. Before them, Neolithic farmers from Anatolia. Inside this vial, the answer to what happened to the people of the ancient Balkans, layer upon layer of human history. Thousands of years of genetic accumulation in one region. 6,000 years of farming, layer upon layer of human habitation compressed into the soil. And then, in less than 2 centuries, almost all of it was replaced. Entire populations vanished from the genetic record. The people who lived here for generations were gone, replaced by a population that had never lived in the Balkans before. When laboratories finally extracted DNA from these burials, the results were staggering. The extraction process takes days, breaking down ancient bone to release fragments of DNA preserved for over 1,000 years. The Slavic expansion, the largest demographic transformation in European history that nobody talks about. When geneticists finally tested the ancient DNA from Balkan burial sites spanning 2,000 years, the genetic profile of the Balkans didn't drift. It shattered, and something completely new took its place. The data showed a genetic cliff. Before the 6th century, one population. After the 7th century, an almost entirely different one. Not gradual mixing, not slow cultural change, near total genetic replacement. To understand what the DNA revealed, you need to understand what the Balkans looked like genetically before the 6th century. Each sample added another data point, and together they revealed a population that had been stable for thousands of years. Ancient DNA from Roman-era Balkans shows exactly what you would expect, a mixed population. The petrous bone behind the ear preserves DNA better than anything else. The key to reading the ancient Balkans: heavy Anatolian Neolithic farmer ancestry, some steppe-derived ancestry from the Bronze Age, traces of local hunter-gatherer lineages surviving from before agriculture arrived. This was the genetic legacy of thousands of years of occupation. Neolithic farmers arriving from Anatolia around 6,000 BC. Bronze Age steppe migrants added their ancestry around 3,000 BC. Romans added Mediterranean genes over 5 centuries. The Bronze Age steppe migration added its own layer. Indo-European speakers arriving from the Pontic steppe around 3000 BC. By the 5th century AD, the genetic profile of the Balkans was thoroughly Mediterranean. The garrisons had held for centuries, but plague and war in the 6th century broke the system. The people of the Roman Balkans were genetically closer to modern Greeks and Italians than to anyone north. Their Y chromosome lineages reflected this mix. Haplogroups JR, AAB, REB, Mediterranean, and Anatolian male lines. Their mitochondrial DNA told the same story. A deep and diverse population with roots stretching back thousands of years. Stable for millennia. And then the 6th century arrived. This was the world that was about to end. 1,000 years of accumulated Mediterranean civilization in the Balkans, from 4 million to fewer than 1 million in a century. The Balkans experienced a population catastrophe before the Slavs arrived. The Byzantine Empire had held the Balkans since the fall of Rome, but the 6th century broke them. The Danube was the border. For centuries, the empire had held the river line against every threat from the north. The Lime system, hundreds of watchtowers and small forts lining the river, the most fortified frontier in the ancient world. But in the 5th and 6th centuries, everything converged at once: plague, war, demographic collapse. The Justinianic plague hit the Balkans in 541. It killed millions across the empire. Modern estimates suggest the Justinianic plague may have killed between 15 and 25% of the Balkans' population. Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium that would later cause the Black Death, it reached the Balkans through trade routes from Egypt. The crossings were often peaceful, families wading across at shallow points, moving into territory nobody was defending. Towns were abandoned. Farmland went fallow. The garrison troops that held the Danube frontier were decimated. And just as the population was at its lowest point, the Slavic migrations began. The timing was devastating. An nth landscape met a moving population. The Slavic homelands in Eastern Europe had been expanding for centuries. By the 6th century, the population pressure was immense. The Slavic peoples had been expanding from their homeland in modern-day Poland, Belarus, and Ukraine for generations. By the late 6th century, they crossed the Danube in waves that the depleted Byzantine garrisons could not stop. Not a single invasion, a sustained demographic movement over decades. The admixture analysis made the genetic cliff visual, a wall of color change at the transition. Mediterranean brown and green replaced by Eastern European blue and purple. Byzantine commanders reported that the frontier garrisons were too depleted by plague and war to hold the line. Procopius, the Byzantine historian, recorded the crossings, describing groups so numerous they could not be counted. But the real question was always whether this was invasion or migration, conquest or colonization. In many areas, the Slavic settlers arrived to find the land already empty, the previous inhabitants gone. For decades, historians argued, was it military conquest imposing Slavic culture on survivors? Or was it a mass migration that physically replaced the people who had lived there? Answered the question. And the answer was replacement. The evidence came from ancient DNA extracted from burials spanning 2,000 years across the Balkans. Hundreds of individuals sampled dozens of sites. The data set covered 2 millennia of continuous habitation. Multiple research teams across Europe collaborated on what became one of the largest ancient DNA studies of a single region. The pottery tells the same story as the DNA Roman ceramics vanish. Slavic handmade pottery appears. Studies from 2020 to 2024 sequenced hundreds of ancient individuals from Serbia, Croatia, Bulgaria, Greece, and North Macedonia. And the pattern was consistent across every site. Before the 7th century, Mediterranean genetic profiles. After the 7th century, a population that looked nothing like the one before. The shift was not gradual, it was a cliff. 1 century Mediterranean. The next, Eastern European. The new population was genetically Central and Eastern European. The old population was Mediterranean. On the principal component analysis plots, the shift was enormous. Post-Slavic Balkan samples clustered with modern Poles, Czechs, and Ukrainians. Pre-Slavic samples clustered with modern Greeks and Italians. Post-Slavic samples clustered with modern Slavic populations. The entire genetic center of gravity shifted from south to north in a single century. Every ancestry component shifted simultaneously. Farmer ancestry collapsed. Eastern European ancestry surged. A wholesale population swap. The Y chromosome data was equally dramatic. The Roman-era male lineages virtually disappeared. Dubrovnik split Zadar. Coastal enclaves where the old Roman-era population survived behind stone walls and Byzantine naval support. JR and AAB, the hallmark Mediterranean and Anatolian male lineages, were replaced by APA and REA. IA today, the most common Y chromosome in the Western Balkans. Over 50% of Croatian and Bosnian men. That lineage was virtually absent in the Roman-era Balkans. It arrived with the Slavic settler. The Y chromosome turnover was even more dramatic than the autosomal shift. The male lines were almost entirely replaced, and the mitochondrial DNA told the same story. The maternal lineages also shifted dramatically, not just the men, the women too. Both paternal and maternal lineages were replaced. When both Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA changed simultaneously, it means whole families moved. Not just warriors, not just raiders, entire communities relocating. Men, women, children, and livestock. Slavic archaeological sites in the Balkans have a distinctive signature: sunken floor houses, handmade pottery. A simpler material culture than the Roman cities they replaced. The models estimated that 80% or more of the ancestry in the post-Slavic Balkans derived from the incoming population. 80%. in the span of 5 or 6 generations. That's not cultural assimilation. That's replacement. But the replacement wasn't uniform. And that is where the picture gets more complex. The terrain told the story. Flat agricultural land was completely transformed. Mountains and coastlines preserved pockets of the old population. The coastal regions, particularly along the Adriatic and in southern Greece, retained more of their pre-Slavic ancestry. At some sites, the abandonment gap lasted decades, long enough for forests to reclaim farmland, long enough for buildings to collapse. The mountains protected some populations. The coast offered escape routes, but the interior was swept clean. The walled coastal cities, places like Dubrovnik and Split, held out. They maintained connections to the Byzantine Empire by sea. Inside those walls, the genetic legacy of the Roman-era population partially survived. Outside them, it was erased. Greece presented a particularly interesting case. Ancient DNA from southern Greece showed more indigenous continuity. Diocletian's palace in Split, a Roman retirement home, became a refugee fortress. Inside, the old genetics survived. The Peloponnese and Crete retained significantly more pre-Slavic ancestry than Serbia or Bulgaria. But even in Greece, the Slavic genetic contribution was substantial, between 20 and 40%. This was one of the most contentious findings. The genetic data challenged a long-held narrative about Greek identity. Crete, separated by water. The Slavic expansion couldn't cross the sea. Cretan DNA stayed Mediterranean. For generations, Greek national identity had been built on the idea of direct continuity from ancient Greece. Modern border towns tell the story DNA confirms. Same population on both sides, divided only by politics. The DNA showed that continuity was partial, real but incomplete, mixed with significant Slavic ancestry. The Thessalian plains offered everything the settlers needed. Flat farmland, water, no barriers. Replacement here was total. But here is where this story gets more complicated than a simple replacement narrative, because replacement doesn't mean what most people think it means. The word replacement implies violence. An army arrives, the local population is killed, new people take their place. But the genetic evidence alone cannot distinguish between violent replacement and replacement by demographic swamping of a depleted population. Plague killed 25%. Avar raids killed more. Economic collapse drove survivors to the cities. The countryside emptied before the Slavs arrived. If plague kills 70% and newcomers fill the empty land, the genetic result is identical. And the Balkans had just suffered the Justinianic plague. 25% dead, cities abandoned, the countryside depopulated. The Slavic settlers didn't necessarily need to kill anyone. They just needed to fill the void, have larger families. Within 3 generations, you outnumber the survivors. At Viminatium, the Roman buildings were physically dismantled for their stone. The Slavic settlers built wooden houses in the ruins. The FST genetic distance between the two populations at Viminatium was as large as the distance between modern Norwegians and modern Greeks. The archaeological evidence actually supports this interpretation in many areas. At many Balkan sites, there is an abandonment layer between the Roman-era occupation and the Slavic settlement. Decades where nobody lived there, the land empty, forests reclaiming the fields. Then the Slavic settlers arrived and rebuilt, but the replacement was mostly demographic. Biology, not battle. Some sites showed violence, cut marks on bones, arrowheads and skeletons, but a minority of burials. And there is a second complication that the DNA revealed. The replacement wasn't a single event. It happened in waves over 2 centuries. Early Slavic settlers in some areas were genetically different from later ones. Multiple source populations contributed to the expansion. Modern Bulgarians carry 3 layers of ancestry: pre-Slavic Mediterranean, Slavic Eastern European, Bulgar Central Asian. The Slavic layer dominates. The ceramic evidence confirmed the genetic findings. Different pottery traditions arrived at different times from different directions. Not one army, not one tribe. Multiple Slavic groups from different origins converging on the same empty territory. The Slavic peoples were not a monolithic block. They were a family of related populations, speaking related languages. And when they settled the Balkans, their genetic differences created regional variation that persists today. Modern Serbs, Croats, and Bulgarians are genetically distinguishable from each other. Not because of pre-Slavic indigenous differences. Modern genetic differences between Balkan nations trace to which Slavic groups settled where, not who lived there before, but because they descend from different Slavic source populations who arrived from different directions. The amount of indigenous pre-Slavic ancestry that survived varied dramatically by region and by circumstance. Geography was destiny. Mountains and coastlines saved genetic diversity. Plains and river valleys lost it. Let's look at the specific sites that tell this story in the most detail. The Mani retained over 70% pre-Slavic ancestry. Thessaloniki under 40%. Geography determined genetic fate because every site had a slightly different version of the same catastrophe. Viminatium, a major Roman city in modern Serbia, one of the best documented cases of genetic replacement. Viminatium was a legionary fortress and provincial capital. 40,000 people lived here at its peak. At its height, Viminatium was the largest city in the Balkans, a legionary base with temples, amphitheaters, and elaborate cemeteries. Ancient DNA from Viminatium's cemeteries, spanning 5 centuries, told the complete story of the transition. Roman period individuals from Viminatium showed typical Mediterranean Anatolian genetic profiles, high farmer ancestry, low steppe contribution. Then the samples from the 7th century onward, completely different. The genetic cliff at Viminatium was so sharp that researchers initially thought they had a sampling error. The lab ran Roman era and Slavic era samples side by side. Same protocols, same instruments. Only time differed. The post-Slavic individuals showed ancestry profiles that matched modern Eastern Europeans. Virtually no continuity with the Roman era population. And the abandonment layer between the two populations confirmed the sequence. The Roman population left or died. The land was empty. Then the Slavic settlers arrived, moving south. The case studies in Bulgaria painted an equally dramatic picture. The Slavic expansion didn't just replace the old diversity. It replaced it with remarkable uniformity. The Balkans went from one of Europe's most diverse regions to one of its most genetically homogeneous. The architecture changed as dramatically as the genetics. Roman stone replaced by Slavic timber. Urban planning replaced by village settlement. Multiple Bulgarian sites showed the same pattern. Roman-era populations with Mediterranean ancestry, replaced by Slavic-derived populations. But Bulgaria had an additional genetic layer, a Central Asian steppe component absent in Serbia or Croatia. The Bulgars, a Turkic-speaking group from the Central Asian steppe, who arrived in the 7th century and gave Bulgaria its name. Bulgaria is named after a Turkic nomadic group. But most modern Bulgarians are genetically Slavic. The Bulgars arrived around 680 AD under Khan Asparov, a Turkic warrior elite who conquered the Slavic settlers. The Bulgars contributed only a small percentage of the ancestry of modern Bulgarians, perhaps 5 to 10%. The Slavic agricultural settlers vastly outnumbered the Bulgar military elite. Over time, the Bulgars were absorbed. A Turkic name on a Slavic population on top of an erased Mediterranean one. 3 layers in one country. Now, the Greek case, the most politically sensitive finding of all. The genetic evidence arrives too late for those who died in wars fought over imaginary biological differences. The Bulgars initially wrote in Greek. Within 2 centuries, they had adopted the Slavic language of their subjects. The agricultural majority absorbed the military minority. The Greek continuity debate has been one of the most explosive topics in Mediterranean archaeology for over a century. Are modern Greeks the direct descendants of ancient Greeks? The DNA answer is complicated. Ancient DNA studies from Greek sites showed that southern Greece retained more pre-Slavic ancestry than any other Balkan region, but the Slavic contribution was still substantial. 20 to 40% of the ancestry in mainland Greek populations derived from Slavic settlers. A new generation of Balkan students is learning what the DNA says, and many are surprised by what they share. Greek genetic continuity has been debated since the 19th century. A German historian claimed modern Greeks were Slavs, but transformation, a population that was half ancient and half Slavic. The islands showed even more continuity. Crete retained the most ancient Greek ancestry of any region tested. Water was the barrier. The Slavic expansion was a land-based movement. Populations on islands and behind mountain ranges survived in higher proportions. The Mediterranean Sea saved Cretan genetics. The Pindus Mountains saved some Peloponnesian genetics. The Mani Peninsula, so rugged and isolated it preserved more pre-Slavic ancestry than anywhere on the mainland. Not conquerors. Farmers, the people who genetically transformed the Balkans, came with plows, not swords. But the plains of Thessaly and Macedonia were transformed almost as completely as Serbia. The question of what happened to the indigenous Balkan populations between the 6th and 8th centuries is one that the DNA is only beginning to answer. The new population was genetically Central and Eastern European. The old population was Mediterranean. Byzantine texts record waves of refugees fleeing south to Constantinople and to the coastal fortresses. The genetic evidence from these coastal populations confirms the texts. Higher Mediterranean ancestry in the refuge zones. The technology to read the genetic history of the Balkans exists. The question is what the living will do with the knowledge. The refugee flows were massive. Entire inland populations relocating to the coast. The genetic evidence tracks the displacement precisely. The refugees carried the old genetic signatures with them. And in the coastal cities, those signatures survived. The old Balkans didn't vanish completely. They retreated to the edges. And the modern genetic landscape of the Balkans is the result. A palimpsest of ancient and medieval ancestry in proportions that vary by geography. So what does all of this mean for the people living in the Balkans today? It means that the genetic history of the region is dramatically different from the cultural narrative. Modern Serbs, Croats, Bosnians, and Bulgarians are genetically near identical, more similar to each other than to any pre-Slavic population. The ethnic divisions that have defined and devastated the region for centuries are cultural, not genetic. The genetic distances between modern Balkan nations are smaller than the distances between towns 50 miles apart in pre-Slavic times. Serbs and Croats speak nearly identical languages. Their DNA is nearly identical too. The wars of the 1990s were fought between populations that the DNA shows are essentially the same people. The divisions are religious and cultural. Serbian Orthodox, Croatian Catholic, Bosnian Muslim. The same ancestral population split by later historical events. The Ottoman conquest created the religious divisions. The Slavic expansion created the population. Same streets, same buildings, same genetics, different mosques and churches. The division was cultural, not biological. But the genetic evidence also reveals something about the nature of large-scale population change. The Slavic expansion was not unique in European history. The Neolithic transition replaced hunter-gatherers. The steppe expansion replaced Neolithic farmers in the north. But the Slavic expansion was the most recent large-scale replacement, and the most complete outside of the Americas. Among documented genetic replacements in recorded history, the Slavic transformation of the Balkans ranks among the most complete on Earth, and it happened in historical time, not deep prehistory. The 6th and 7th centuries AD, the Slavic expansion transformed more of Europe's genetic landscape than any other event in the past 2,000 years. And in the Balkans, it did so almost completely. The people who live in the Balkans today are overwhelmingly descended from Slavic settlers who arrived 1,400 years ago. The Romans who built the roads, the Thracians who mined the gold, the Illyrians who sailed the Adriatic. Their genetic signatures are faint echoes now. New studies continue to refine the picture, each year bringing higher resolution to the genetic map of the Slavic expansion. Still detectable in the DNA of modern Balkan people, but minority components in populations that are fundamentally Slavic. The buildings survive. The roads survive. The DNA did not. And for the modern Balkans, This finding carries weight that extends beyond the laboratory, because if the people of the Balkans are genetically almost the same population divided by culture and religion, then the ancient hatreds that tore the region apart were built on a misunderstanding of who they actually are. The scientific consensus is clear. Ethno-nationalist claims of biological uniqueness in the Balkans are contradicted by the genetic evidence. The DNA doesn't solve political conflicts, but it does remove the biological argument for them. The populations of the Balkans fought wars over differences that the DNA shows do not exist at the genetic level. The Slavic expansion made them one people. History convinced them they were many. The borders that divide the Balkans today were drawn across a population that the DNA shows is fundamentally one people. The Balkans have always been a crossroads. Every empire that crossed Europe passed through here, but the Slavic expansion was the one that rewrote the genetic code of the entire region, not the Ottomans. The Slavic farmers who filled the empty land. Fingerprints in the clay, 1,400 years old. The actual touch of the settlers whose descendants now fill the Balkans. The anonymous settlers, no written records of their names. No monuments to their arrival, just DNA buried in the soil for 14 centuries, now readable for the first time. What the DNA says is clear. The Balkans today were built by people who arrived after Rome fell. Every Balkan city sits on layers, Roman foundations beneath Slavic streets beneath Ottoman markets. If you found this investigation compelling, subscribe for more episodes where we test history against the evidence. The Balkans still have thousands of untested burial sites, and every one of them has a story to tell. The next generation of Balkan archaeologists is reading its own genetic history and finding ancestors they never expected. Let me know in the comments. Does knowing the DNA change how you think about the Balkans? Sources in the description below.